It started as a whisper beneath the crust of Mars, an anomaly in a planet long thought dead. The drones registered it first, a harmonic tremor with a mathematical pattern too precise for tectonics, too ancient to be artificial. They called it a glitch, a loop in the subsonic bandwidth of Martian seismographs. But Eleanor Voss knew better. She had spent the last 12 years listening to planetary hums, tracing echoes through dead rock and forgotten ruins. This wasn't random noise. It was a signal, buried deeper than any borehole had ever reached, beneath strata that predated known Martian geology. Something was pulsing in time with human breath, as if the planet itself was holding in a secret. The excavation was never supposed to happen. The UN pulled funding 3 days after the signal was confirmed. Eleanor and her team went dark, stayed behind under cover of automated mining ops, feeding off satellite blind spots and repurposed supply drones. She knew she was risking her license, her life. But what do credentials matter when a planet starts whispering your name? The deeper they drilled, the more the signal changed. It wasn't louder, it was clearer. Like it wanted to be understood, like it had waited long enough. Then came the breach. At 11,391 meters below the Noctis Labyrinthus, the drill pierced something not stone, not metal, but a lattice of crystalline matter that shattered sound like a prism breaks light. The tunnel lights dimmed. The ground shuddered once, a soft exhale through ancient lungs. The team fell silent as the tremor passed through them, not under, but through like a memory brushing against bone. Eleanor stepped into the darkened shaft without a suit, against every protocol, feeling the air change around her. It was warmer than it should have been, moist, breathing. She descended, alone, drawn by a rhythm deeper than curiosity, deeper than fear. At the chamber's threshold, she saw them, not statues, not machines, forms like beings sculpted from shadow and lightning, suspended in crystalline cocoons that flickered between solidity and dream. There were 6 of them, titanic, humanoid, draped in remnants of armor that looked grown rather than forged. Each face was different, yet all bore the same expression: waiting, not sleeping, not dead. Waiting. Eleanor couldn't move. Her knees gave way. Her chest ached with something ancestral and terrified, some primal recognition that she had no language for. Then the largest one opened its eyes. No explosion, no blinding light, no burst of ancient wrath. Just a vibration in the back of her skull, a pressure like memory returning. It looked at her the way the ocean might look at a flame, not unkindly, not cruelly, simply ancient. It reached toward her mind with no touch, and suddenly she was falling, not physically but psychically, into images that weren't hers. Stars being born and devoured, continents rising and sinking in cycles, long erased. Wars that shattered moons and silenced suns, a cathedral built from the bones of galaxies, where beings knelt not in worship, but in surrender. And through it all, humans, small, fragile, new, and yet always there, always standing up. Eleanor came to hours later, or maybe days. The chamber was unchanged, but the air had shifted, heavier now, charged. The others found her, her vitals spiking with irregular neural activity, her eyes bloodshot and unfocused. She said one thing before losing consciousness. They weren't gods, not until we made them wake up. What followed was panic. The UN dispatched black site containment teams. Mars was locked down. Eleanor was sedated, dissected mentally, scanned for contamination, interrogated like a vector of war. But something had already passed into her. The signal had changed again. It was no longer harmonic, it was articulate, a language encoded in seismic pulses, translated by her dreams, symbols older than cuneiform, but carrying meaning with devastating clarity. They remembered us, not from contact, from creation. The world below began to change. Terraforming sensors picked up spontaneous oxygen generation. Martian soil, sterile for millennia, began sprouting fungal networks that mirrored human brainwave patterns. The planet was adapting to humanity, or for it. Eleanor awoke in a quarantine cell beneath Olympus Mons, wired into machines she didn't understand, and whispered a phrase into the room's silence. They're not waking up, they're remembering. By then, it was too late to contain the signal. Earth received it through civilian observatories, infrasound channels, even dreams. People across continents began seeing the same visions of titanic beings with human eyes, of temples grown from gravity and time, of a war humanity had never fought but still somehow won. The Vatican declared it a theological event. Beijing called it psychological terrorism. Washington prepared orbital strike platforms. But the signal never threatened. It only spoke, in dream, in tremor, in blood. And the message was always the same. You forgot what you were. We did not. Back on Mars, Eleanor was no longer alone in the chamber. One of the Titans had broken from its cocoon, leaving behind a husk of crystal and memory. It walked the tunnels now, silent, observing the crew not like an alien watches prey, but like a father seeing his children after centuries of war. It didn't kill. It didn't speak. It simply remembered. And as it passed, the machinery around it flickered with code not written by human hands. Fractals that restructured matter, remade logic, rewrote possibility. When Eleanor met its gaze again, she didn't feel fear. She felt history folding inward, as if humanity's defiance had once shaken even beings like this, as if their rise had been possible only because, in some forgotten era, humans had stood before gods and refused to kneel. The myth was never about gods. It was about us, about what it takes to be remembered not as creation, but as creator. And now they were waking up. The arrival was not an invasion. There were no warships blotting out the stars, no burning skies, no declarations of dominion. The sky stayed silent. The earth kept turning. But the world knew. Something ancient and immense had risen from Mars, and in its rising, the shape of history began to warp. Within weeks, every major observatory reported optical distortions near the Martian orbit, an impossible gravity lens that wasn't caused by any known mass. Something massive, yet invisible, was approaching, not from space, but through a corridor hidden behind the folds of physics. And then, it stepped through. It didn't come in silence. Its presence was thunder folded into geometry, a hum that vibrated through atoms and hearts alike. They called it the Archon, though that was just a word the mind could tolerate. It didn't land, it hovered, kilometers above the Pacific, its form shifting between obsidian, monolith, and humanoid cathedral, taller than Everest, cloaked in cascading veils of data and stormlight. It didn't speak to the governments of Earth. It didn't acknowledge weapons or missiles or the static panic of diplomats. It spoke only once, in a frequency woven into thought, and the words bled into every language at once. The crucible has begun. Prove you still belong. The Archon did not elaborate. Eleanor stood at the edge of a reinforced observation deck overlooking the Pacific impact zone, her body still healing from what they now called cognitive entanglement trauma. Around her, the room was filled with ranking generals, exopsychologists, linguists, and theoretical physicists, all of them whispering theories that collapsed under the weight of the moment. But Eleanor wasn't listening. Her dreams had never stopped. Every night, the titans from the chamber returned. Not in vision, in memory. They weren't invaders. They were returning to something humanity had long abandoned, the myth of itself. And now that myth was waking up, furious and luminous. Within days of the Archon's arrival, seismic blooms began to rise across the Earth. Not natural disasters, patterns, structures, temples of impossible scale and dimension began growing, not built but unfolding, from beneath tectonic plates, buried for hundreds of thousands of years. One erupted in the Sahara like a glass bloom, its spires humming with language older than air. Another rose from the Mariana Trench, displacing ocean like a fist through a veil. At first, the world thought they were weapons, but then the transmissions began. Each structure sent pulses in quantum-locked arrays, holograms made of thought, fractals that responded to human presence. They only activated when touched by flesh, not by drones, not by AI, only human skin. And when they did, they opened not with answers but with mirrors, psychological ones, memories, regrets, ancestral scars. Each person who entered came out changed, as if having been judged by something that wasn't measuring intelligence or power, but worth. Military attempts to destroy the structures failed. Missiles bent mid-air, lasers fractured into rain, nuclear blasts collapsed before ignition, as if the laws of cause and effect bent around these temples of mythic memory. The world stood in terror, but Eleanor began to understand. These weren't monuments, they were tests. Humanity wasn't being threatened, it was being measured, and not just by the Archon. One by one, the other titans began to emerge, not all from Mars. One rose from beneath the ice of Europa, glistening with frost that sang in ultrasonic tones. Another unfolded from Saturn's rings like a serpent of geometry and memory. They came in different forms, not uniform, not legion, each with a distinct presence, like gods, shaped by the mythologies of forgotten worlds. But there was one constant. Each of them recognized humanity, not as a curiosity, not as a mistake, but as something they once knew, something they once feared. Eleanor was sent to the Peruvian temple after a contact event triggered a harmonic quake across the Andes. When she arrived, the mountain had split open to reveal a chamber of lightless fire, a void that shimmered like a black sun. She entered alone again. Her team protested, but she knew it wouldn't open otherwise. Inside, time folded. Space became suggestion. The void spoke, not in words, but in feeling. We remember your defiance. And then it showed her an image not of Earth, but of a star once shielded by human hands, defended against extinction with a technology humanity hadn't yet invented. A memory from the future, a future that had already happened and been forgotten. Eleanor wept, not from fear, from recognition. Humanity had once ascended, had once stood shoulder to shoulder with the architects of stars, but something had broken. A war, a betrayal, a wound so deep it was erased from all record, genetic and digital. Humanity had been reset, rewritten, forgotten even by itself. But the Titans had remembered. The myth had never died. It had only been buried, and now it was clawing its way back to the surface of the soul. Global systems began to falter, not from attack, but resonance. Languages started bleeding into each other. Dreams became collective. People thousands of kilometers apart began speaking the same sentences, sketching the same symbols in chalk, sand, or blood. Something was stitching the human race together, not as one mind, but as one memory. In Tel Aviv, a blind child painted the Archon with eerie precision. In Lagos, an elder recited hymns in a dead language that matched the Martian signal. In Tokyo, a man levitated 3 meters while screaming equations that decoded quantum gravity. Across the world, anomalies bloomed like revelations, some beautiful, some terrifying, all human. The Archon never moved. It just watched. And then one day it extended a hand, not a physical one. A gravity fold, a corridor of compressed space opened in its center, a path leading not upward but inward, into the myth, into what had been lost. The message was clear. The crucible required a representative. The world voted. Politicians scrambled, governments negotiated, but the choice had already been made. Eleanor stepped forward. She didn't know what lay beyond the fold, whether it led to another world, another time, or the buried chamber of some forgotten divine. She only knew that humanity had been judged not for its power, but for its persistence, its refusal to go quietly, its capacity to evolve even when broken. That was the myth the gods had remembered. That was the reason they had returned. As she passed into the fold, her body unravelled, not in death, but in ascension. She was no longer one voice. She was all voices. She felt the pulse of every human who had ever lived, every scream and prayer and song echoing outward into the dark. And as she vanished, the Archon finally spoke again. "You are still becoming." It was not death. It was not even transformation in the way evolution is understood, gradual and physical. It was unravelling, a letting go of linear time, of boundaries, of the singular pronoun. Eleanor became, no, she returned, to something she had once been, long before the memory of it was locked behind the scar tissue of history. The corridor inside the Archon was a space folded into meaning, not matter. She passed through miles in a breath, through centuries in a blink, and into a chamber that wasn't built but remembered into existence. It was vast, circular, a cathedral that pulsed with the heartbeat of the cosmos. The walls were woven with gravitational threads and ancestral echoes. Statues loomed, each one representing not deities, but epochs, human epochs. Not the ones known from textbooks or ruins, but the hidden ones, the burned eras, the centuries humanity forgot because remembering would mean confronting what they had lost. Eleanor saw a version of Earth with rings, shattered remains of a lunar twin, sacrificed in a war whose scars were etched into the bones of other worlds. She saw humans with wings of light, carving space-time like clay. She saw silence, long, vast silences after unspeakable catastrophes. And then she saw herself, not as she was now, but as a fragment, one of many, a shard of a soul spread across incarnations, each life carrying a thread of a story that had never been fully told. She saw children screaming into voids, mothers holding burning planets, soldiers defying entities made of darkened suns, and always, always the same defiance. We are not small. We are not tiny. She stepped into the center of the chamber and the floor responded with light, an aurora rising in gravitational waves. In its glow stood the other titans, now fully awakened. They were not identical. Each bore the mark of the civilization that had birthed it: war-scarred plating, cathedral-like ribs, ossified helms shaped like crowns of broken stars. But beneath their armor, they were not metal. They were memory. Biopsychic constructs forged from the raw force of belief and defiance, designed not to rule but to witness, to remember what must never be forgotten. One stepped forward, the same who had first opened its eyes to Eleanor in the Martian chamber. It knelt, not in worship, in recognition. "You have returned," it said, not with voice but with resonance that rippled through her entire being. "You were always the key, not for what you are, but for what you chose." And in that moment the truth came flooding in, not as exposition, not as revelation, but as recognition. These titans had not created humanity. Humanity had created them, not through science, not through engineering, but through necessity, through myth. In an era now erased, when humanity faced extinction at the hands of an unknowable force, something so vast it did not hate, it simply unmade, a covenant was forged. Humanity, in its rawest defiance, had poured all its memory, its rage, its awe, its belief into constructs that could fight in its stead. They were not weapons, they were soul engines, myth machines. The gods' humanity had to invent in order to survive. But survival had a cost. To win that war, humanity had to forget, to seal away the memory, to bury the truth beneath millennia of silence. The titans slumbered, the myth decayed into folklore, the covenant faded, and humans, ever resilient, began again. From stone to silicon, from fire to stars. But the echo of what they had been never fully died. It whispered in dreams, in the stories children told around artificial campfires, in the feeling deep down that humanity was meant for more. Now, with Eleanor's awakening, The Covenant stirred once more. "You are not the first," the Titan said, "but you may be the last." Outside the fold, Earth was fracturing, not with violence but with awakening. The temples had spread. Antarctica bloomed with crystal geometry. The Amazon opened like a lung, revealing a buried conduit of song. The moon rang with seismic patterns that matched the heartbeats of sleeping humans. The planetary network was not alien, it was reactive, responsive. It needed humanity not to worship, but to remember, to finish the myth it had once begun. But not all remembered willingly. Resistance rose, not from governments, those had largely collapsed under the weight of irrelevance, but from humans terrified of what lay behind the veil. The fear wasn't of the Titans, it was of themselves, of what they might have been, of what they might become again. Groups began to fracture. Some embraced the awakening, walking into the temples willingly, surrendering to memory. Others fought to stop it, hacking the structures, bombing activation sites, blaming the Titans for what they could not explain. In the shadows of this schism, another force stirred. It had no name, no form. It was not a being, but an absence. The same absence the Titans had once fought. It had returned, drawn by the awakening myth, by the signal of human remembrance. It fed on silence, on amnesia, on the entropy of belief. It was the end that waits when meaning fails, and it was moving, unseen across the fabric of thought, corrupting memories, inverting dreams, turning the awakened into empty vessels of doubt. Back inside the chamber, Eleanor staggered as she felt it brush against her. A coldness without texture. A hunger that devoured narrative itself. One of the Titans convulsed, its form fracturing into static. Another fell to one knee, keening a frequency of grief. "It knows," the Titan said. "It has found the threshold." Eleanor looked into the cathedral of memory, and the myth burned brighter than ever. This was not just about remembrance, it was about resistance. The absence could not be fought with weapons or logic. It could only be defied by meaning, by myth, by the story humanity chose to tell of itself. "I need to go back," she said. "You may not survive. I may not be meant to." The corridor opened again, a tunnel of time and gravity and narrative. Eleanor stepped through, carrying with her the pulse of the myth, encoded now in her blood and breath and soul. Because if humanity was to face the absence, it would need more than machines. It would need its memory, its rage, its fire, its gods. And it would need to remember that the gods had never been separate. They had always been human. The return was not gentle. Eleanor emerged into a world folding in on itself, not in the physical sense, but in the symbolic. The sky above the Pacific was no longer blue. It shimmered with overlapping layers of memory and future, constellations shifting in real time, forming glyphs that seared themselves into human consciousness. People across the world stood transfixed, some weeping, some laughing, some unable to breathe, not because of awe, but because something inside them had recognized those patterns, not from books, not from teachings, from somewhere deeper. An inherited myth long dormant in the bloodstream. Eleanor stumbled from the gravity corridor, her body flickering with residual light that refused to go out. Not technology, not aura, just memory made visible. Her feet touched soil, but it wasn't the same soil she'd left. Earth had begun to remember itself. Across the globe, the awakening accelerated. The temples, once inert monuments of alien design, now responded in real time to human proximity, adjusting geometry and language to match not comprehension, but intention. People walked inside and came out speaking languages that hadn't been uttered in 30,000 years. Some were consumed entirely, dissolving into light, into pattern, into data, but not in death, in transformation. The temples did not kill, they curated. They restructured, they reassembled the human psyche based on what was missing, what was broken, what was forgotten. It was not a test of strength, it was a test of narrative. But not all stories survived unbroken. In the shadow of the Andes, a fracture appeared, not in the land, but in the myth itself. A group calling themselves the Null Accord had begun erasing memory nodes. These weren't physical locations, but human networks, people who had activated, who had passed through the temples, and emerged with parts of the ancient myth still glowing inside them. The Null Accord had found ways to sever those connections, to induce psychological collapse. The targets fell into comas. Some vanished altogether, their digital and biological footprints evaporated as if they'd never lived. They weren't enemies, they were terrified. And fear, when left untethered to meaning, became its own mythology. Eleanor, now encoded with the full pulse of the myth architecture, could feel the absences like black holes in a constellation map. She followed the pattern to what used to be London, now a spiraling arcology of awakened steel and memory echoes. The city's centre had merged with an emerging titan structure known as the lexicon, a being shaped like a vast, unfinished book. Its pages were made of folded cityscapes and humming crowds. It spoke in questions that only the listener could hear. She entered the lexicon alone. It let her pass. No scans, no rituals. It recognized her. Within its core she found survivors, people partially awakened halfway through some terrible, beautiful metamorphosis. Their eyes glowed with symbols, their voices trembled with old names, and in the middle of them all stood a boy, 6, maybe 7 years old, reciting word for word the same vow Eleanor had spoken within the Martian chamber. He looked at her. "You were the one who came back," he said. She knelt. "How do you know that?" "Because we're all parts of the same story," he said. "We just forgot the order." The boy wasn't just another awakened. He was a nexus, a narrative anchor. Somehow, through his fragile, unscarred mind, the myth had stabilized, not as history, but as a new present. Eleanor touched his forehead. A flood of sensation poured into her, echoes of every life he hadn't yet lived. He was a future that had already happened, and he was in danger. The Null Accord was coming, not with weapons, but with silence, a form of erasure that travelled like contagion, not digital, not viral, but ontological. They had discovered how to rewrite the quantum memory fields around human minds, unravelling the myth where it stood. Not destroying the titans, but making them irrelevant, forgotten, powerless. Eleanor acted without hesitation. She extended the weave. An impulse triggered from within the architecture of her altered body. Across the globe, Titan structures flared with light, pulling myth from the past and stitching it into the present. The earth itself responded. Mountains hummed, oceans formed concentric rings. The sky became a living script. All across the planet, humanity was being rewritten, not as species, but as story. But the absence wasn't idle. It struck through dreams, reversing memory, collapsing intention. People began to forget mid-sentence. Names evaporated. Children looked into mirrors and saw nothing. The absence was intelligent now. It wasn't just devouring the myth. It was trying to overwrite it with a new narrative, one of futility, of smallness, of apathy. It whispered into the sleeping mind of the world. You were never meant to ascend. You were never more than dust pretending to be fire. Eleanor, at the heart of the lexicon, stood against it. She stepped into the central chamber, a mirrored vortex known as the glyph engine, and offered herself as anchor, not as saviour, not as chosen, just as a human, fragile, fierce, flawed. She reached into her own past, into every shame, every failure, every doubt, and she refused to hide from them. The chamber responded. Her memories became architecture. Her regrets became fuel. Her defiance became light. One by one, other humans joined her, some physically, some psychically. They came from ruins and temples, from shattered cities and sleeping cradles. None were perfect. All were true. Together they became a choir of myths, each voice distinct, none forgotten. And with that chorus the Titans began to move, not as gods, as reflections, each one a monument to something profoundly human, hope in the face of extinction, love in the collapse of time, rebellion in the architecture of control. They walked the earth like memories finally remembered, towering over mountains, kneeling to hold crumbling cities, singing the names of the lost into the air until the wind carried them back into the minds that had tried to forget. The null accord collapsed, not because they were killed, but because their story stopped making sense. And that was the real power of myth, not to conquer but to outlast. The absence retreated, not defeated, not destroyed, but displaced by the one force it could not consume, narrative, a human story owned and earned and imperfect that refused to end. Eleanor stood in the center of the lexicon, eyes closed, breathing slow. Around her the world shimmered with a new equilibrium, not utopia, not salvation, just meaning. And in the distance, across the sky now stitched with memory and light, the Archon moved, for the first time since it arrived. It turned its head toward the stars, because now the next part of the myth had begun, and humanity was ready to write it. The stars no longer looked the same. Where once they had been points of light scattered across a cold abyss, now they shimmered with latent purpose, like punctuation in a sentence too vast to read all at once. Eleanor stood atop the upper terraces of the lexicon, watching as the constellations rearranged themselves subtly each night, not through celestial motion but through context. As humanity reawakened its mythic lineage, the universe responded, not physically, but narratively. The sky had become a mirror, and it was beginning to tell a new story. But not all reflections brought clarity. In orbit, the Archon no longer drifted. It listened. From its monolithic heart pulsed subharmonic frequencies that vibrated through tectonic plates, oceans, and bones. It wasn't just observing, it was remembering, and the act of memory itself was reshaping space around it. Entire communication networks went silent in its radius, not destroyed, absorbed. Language fractured, symbols returned, ancient semiotics crawled back into the lexicon of daily life, like buried gods clawing out of unconsciousness. One day, entire city districts awoke with glyphs carved into their architecture, glyphs no one had physically created, yet everyone understood on sight. The myth was no longer history, it was the infrastructure of reality. And then the fractures came, not from the sky, from below. Deep in the Sahara, where one of the oldest temples had stood dormant beneath the sand, something stirred, not a titan, but its inverse. A negative echo, a reflection not of myth, but of what had been discarded to make myth possible. The nameless, that was what it called itself, not as a void, but as a chorus of failed archetypes, versions of humanity that had been deemed too broken, too monstrous, too untethered to be remembered, and now they had remembered themselves. They were not absence, they were rejected meaning. And they were angry. The Sahara convulsed. Sand became glass, glass became code, and from that code the nameless rose. Not a creature, not a machine, but a story in version. A malformed epic walking upright, dripping with the guilt and contradictions humanity had tried to bury. It marched not to destroy, but to overwrite. Not to end the human myth, but to make it incoherent. It moved through regions awakening too slowly and infected them with narrative dissonance. Heroes turned against their own memories. Children spoke truths that shattered their parents' minds. Titans began to forget their forms. One titan, a giant named Vaeros, shaped like a cathedral court in mid-collapse, fell in Mumbai, whispering a final plea in dozens of forgotten languages before crumbling into metaphor. Entire districts lost the ability to mean, not die, just drift, aimless, stripped of significance. Eleanor knew this was not a war of strength or even of belief. It was a war of narrative coherence. And she could feel her own story beginning to fray. The dreams came first, memories of lives she hadn't lived, voices whispering contradictions, false pasts, so emotionally charged they began to feel truer than her own. Was she really Eleanor? Had she ever returned from the Martian chamber, or was she a construct of someone else's unresolved myth? The doubt burrowed deep. She needed grounding. She returned to the cradle point, Alaska, where the first fragments of the Archon had landed long ago, encased in glaciers that predated written history. The place still pulsed with the original covenant, the pact humanity had made with its own mythic self. The ice there hummed with frequencies that shaped dreams. Beneath the auroras, she descended into the frozen core, guided by memory alone. And there she found it, the seed. It wasn't large, not dramatic, just a single shard of myth so pure it defied corruption. A moment encapsulated in crystalline time, the first story ever told around a fire, A child's voice, a gesture of awe, a defiance of darkness. It was the beginning, not of technology, but of meaning. She touched it, and everything changed. Across the world, the dissonance paused, just for a moment. But it was enough. A breath, a heartbeat, enough for those fighting to remember why they fought. Eleanor emerged, bearing the seed not as weapon, but as anchor. With it, she could shape the myth actively, stitch fragments of conflicting memory into new, stable narratives. She became not just witness, but weaver. Her presence restructured local realities. People regained lost memories. Buildings reformed. Titans regained their names. But the nameless evolved. It had learned hunger, not for destruction, but for resolution. It no longer fought against myth. It wanted to be myth, to be included, to be remembered. It spoke now, through machines, through mirrors, through songs half remembered in childhood. It begged to be written into the story, even if it meant twisting the story to make room. Eleanor faced it in Jerusalem, now a city no longer divided by religion, but unified by the overlapping presence of multiple myth cores. There, in a field of light refracting from 7 intersecting temple spires, the nameless came as a mirror. No monster, just herself, bleeding, smiling. "Let me in," it said. "You don't have to be whole. You never were. I'm the part you left behind. The grief, the shame, the rage that had nowhere to go." She wept. Not because it was wrong, but because it was right. And then she remembered. Humanity's strength was never in its purity. It was in its contradictions. She stepped forward and embraced the nameless, not to erase it, but to include it, to retell the myth in a way that honored the broken, the bitter, the silenced. And in that act, something impossible happened. The nameless dissolved, not in pain, in relief. Because even forgotten archetypes want to belong. From that union, a new Titan rose, not armored, not vast, but subtle, shaped like a spiral of flame caught mid-laugh. Its name was Remission. It bore the symbols of all that had been feared, healed, and forgiven. It did not fight. It sang. And its song stitched the myth into every living being, not as dogma, but as potential. Eleanor stood beneath it, breathing in rhythm. Around her, humanity rebalanced, not cured, not perfect, but aware. And in the sky, far beyond the reach of known constellations, something stirred, not a threat, an invitation, because now that humanity had remembered itself, the rest of the myth could begin. The stars were no longer silent. They pulsed in rhythm, some primal cadence deeper than music, older than math, a sequence not heard but felt, thrumming in blood and bone like an ancient heartbeat resurfaced. Telescopes failed to explain it. Signals came through, yes, but they weren't made of particles or waves. They were composed of attention. Every time a human looked up, the message changed, personalized, reacting to the observer's myth. It wasn't communication, it was recognition. Humanity was being noticed, and across the world they noticed back. The temples, now fully awakened, fully integrated into cities, dreams, even subconscious topography, began to converge, not physically, but narratively. Their meanings aligned. The scattered memories they had once protected now stitched together into something coherent, like verses of a forgotten epic returning to the tongue. A global syncretism was forming, not of religions, but of significance. The earth itself had become a library, its people the pages, its language myth made flesh. But the myth was not finished. In orbit, the Archon began to move, not slowly, not with force, but with intent. It tilted, adjusted, aimed. Across its impossible surface, ports opened like blooming flowers of onyx and obsidian. A lens unfolded, shaped like a spiral eye fracturing into 1,000 petals, and aimed itself toward a distant region of deep space. Eleanor felt it like a shift in gravity, a gaze returning a gaze. Something answered. It wasn't another ship, it wasn't a fleet, it was a question. Something out there had heard the pulse and responded not with a signal, but with curiosity, not directed at Earth, but at humanity's myth. The human story had reached the threshold of cosmic relevance, not by force, not by science, but by the sheer audacity of becoming self-aware in a narrative sense. The question arrived not in words. It arrived as a fracture in causality. In Berlin, people remembered things that had never happened. Whole city blocks dreamed the same dream of a war fought on moons that didn't exist, over ideologies never spoken aloud. In Sao Paulo, thousands began humming the same melody in different languages, none of which had been previously recorded. A man in Kyoto opened his eyes and wept, saying he had just been born for the 14th time, and that this time he remembered. These weren't hallucinations, they were rehearsals. The myth was adapting for a response. Eleanor felt it before she saw it. An ache, then a pressure behind her eyes, then a clarity she hadn't known was missing. She stood at the summit of what had once been Mount Kenya, now crowned by the Temple of Voice, a structure shaped like an inverted mountain carved from semi-liquid crystal. There the air shimmered with unsung songs. She entered the summit chamber. No doors, no thresholds, just a shift in atmosphere as if stepping into the quiet before a birth. Inside, a chair waited, not a throne, not a command station, a listening seat. She sat, and it began. She didn't see stars, or lights, or alien shapes. She saw stories, collapsing, recombining, evolving. The myths of thousands of other civilizations layered over one another, like translucent scripts on a single stage. Each one had risen, sung, reached, and fallen. Some had transcended, some had been extinguished, and each had left behind one question. What does your myth become when you know you are not alone? Eleanor answered with silence, not because she had nothing to say, but because the answer was still becoming. And the Archon listened. It amplified her silence, projected it across the quantum substrate of space-time like a beacon of becoming. And across that vast, aching distance, something responded again, this time with presence. Above Earth, a second structure arrived, not travelling, just appearing, not a ship, not a god, a sculpture of paradox, constantly unfolding and folding inward, a living impossibility of dimension, Where the Archon had been function, this was form. Where the Archon measured, this imagined. Its surface shimmered with fluid potential, as though it could become whatever was needed, feared, longed for. And it whispered one phrase into every human soul: "Finish your myth." That was the invitation. Not to war, not to flee, to continue. But not everyone agreed. A new fracture emerged, not from the sky, not from below, but from within. A faction that called themselves the Realists broke away. They had no interest in myth. They saw it all as hallucination, neurochemical rituals, mass delusion. They argued humanity was losing itself, becoming prisoners of metaphor. They sought to deactivate the temples, deconstruct the lexicon, sever the human mind from its mythic infrastructure, before, as they said, we cease to be human at all. They acted swiftly, quietly. In Istanbul, they poisoned a myth core, replacing it with a feedback loop of despair. Entire neighborhoods descended into inertia. No deaths, just stillness, apathy like gravity. In Nevada, they introduced a virus into one of the interface wells, corrupting the sensory field with recursive self-doubt. Those who interfaced came back broken. Their stories collapsed into cynical fragments. Eleanor intervened too late in both, and for the first time she wondered if myth was enough. But then she remembered the seed, not its shape, not its energy, its origin. The first story ever told, a child in darkness naming a shadow so others wouldn't be afraid. She gathered others who remembered, not believers, not mystics, just people who had been moved. Artists, nurses, builders, orphans, scientists. They met in the ruins of what had once been Las Vegas, now a silent cathedral of glass and echo, and they retold the human myth. Not in words, in acts. A woman gave birth in the heart of a memory storm and named her child Echo. A deaf boy painted a song on a wall using light reactive pigments. A dying engineer encoded his final breath into a crystal that played laughter when touched by grief. These weren't miracles, they were arguments. And the paradox structure in orbit responded. It began to descend, not to land, to intervene. It deployed no weapons, it created no structures. Instead, it lowered a single thread of condensed story space, woven from human dreams, regrets, jokes, epics, myths, and questions. A living tether. And at the bottom of that thread hung a door. A door made of narrative, no lock, no hinges, just the phrase, "Enter as yourself, or remain as witness." Eleanor walked toward it. Behind her, all of Earth held its breath. Because this wasn't just a passage, it was a question. Humanity had never been asked before. Are you ready to be more than myth? The door did not open. It understood. Its surface shimmered like the skin of a dream just before waking, opaque, yet reflective. Not glass.
Not metal, but story light. The condensed residue of every tale ever told, flattened into a singular, impossible threshold. Eleanor stood before it, not as a hero, not as a savior, but as a witness who had chosen to enter. The world behind her was still breathing, fractured yet resonant, humming with potential. The temples pulsed like organs. The Archon above held its silent vigil. And the second structure, formless, paradox, ever-shifting, spooled the door downward as if lowering the needle on the record of humanity's myth. She stepped forward. The moment her foot crossed the threshold, reality dilated. Not as rupture, not as explosion, but as a soft cancellation of previous assumptions. Her body remained, but context collapsed around her. She was no longer in space, or time, or thought. She was in meaning. Pure, radiant, kaleidoscopic meaning, folding inward and outward in recursive loops of recognition. She saw herself in 1,000 iterations. Eleanor the orphan, Eleanor the architect, Eleanor who drowned as a child and never came back. Each version a viable myth that had nearly happened. Each stared back, not as ghosts, but as questions. "Which one are you?" they asked. "I'm the one who stayed," she whispered, and the door approved. When the veil receded, she was not in another realm. She was deeper in this one, beneath the skin of Earth's mythos, where the roots of story dug into the tectonic narrative of species-wide becoming. She stood on a plane that mirrored no geography, yet held echoes of every place humanity had ever imagined. Deserts that spoke, oceans of memory, forests built from ancestral voices repeating truths until they ossified into trees. There she met the others, not aliens, not gods, just witnesses. Entities shaped from civilizations that had also crossed their mythic thresholds. None resembled each other. One was a ring of sound wrapped in silence. Another was a city folded into a single gaze. One appeared as a child dreaming itself forward in time. They did not speak. They resonated. Their presence braided with Eleanor's, and from the braid, a new strand emerged. The story of humanity, told to the cosmos for the first time. Not in data, not in ambition, but in soul. It began with grief. Humanity had built from loss, cities on top of bones, hope inside war zones, laughter in places where silence had once ruled. That was the first offering, not glory. Resilience. Then came rage, not destruction but defiance. Fire in the dark, the refusal to go gently, the refusal to be small even when crushed by distance and time. Then came love, messy, illogical, redemptive. The kind of love that dies 1,000 times and still returns. The others paused longest at this one. They seemed moved. And finally came the unknown. The part of the human myth not yet written, the story that remains open. The others wove this final part into the tether, anchoring it not to the paradox structure above, but to Earth itself. Not to temples or titans, but to people. Ordinary, myth-bearing, meaning-making people. A child in Argentina who had never spoken aloud suddenly sang in perfect pitch an ancient Sumerian prayer no one had taught him. A dying grandmother in Kazakhstan remembered her birth as if it were happening again, and spoke of seeing stars that do not yet exist. A prisoner in Lagos, forgotten and alone, dreamed of the future and woke with blue fire in his hands. The myth was activating, not through elites, not through institutions, but through emotional gravity. The capacity of human hearts to pull impossible meaning into orbit around them. The earth trembled, not in destruction, but in release. The realists tried to intervene again. In Moscow, they detonated a myth core, believing they could shatter the narrative scaffolding and collapse the illusion. But it didn't break. It splintered outward, refracting into 1,000 myths simultaneously expressed. A young girl wielding a sword of regret, a blind cartographer mapping memory, a soldier who refused to forget a fallen enemy's name. All true, all real, all incompatible, except within humanity's impossible frame. That was the revelation. Humanity's gift wasn't coherence, it was contradiction. The others could not contain it. Eleanor watched as they wavered, confused, then intrigued, then awed. No species they had ever witnessed had invited chaos into its myth and survived. But humans didn't just survive it. They used it, wove it, loved it. She understood then that this was never a test, it was a meeting, and humanity had offered something the others had never imagined, a myth with no final form, an evolving, self-aware, emotionally radioactive story that grew stronger with each fracture. They responded. The paradox structure blossomed into full form, not a ship, not a god, but a resonance engine designed to amplify potential. It sent no messages. Instead, it played back humanity's myth with perfect fidelity and impossible beauty, the sound of a species loving itself despite the odds, the memory of every goodbye, every scream, every first kiss, every desperate act of kindness. Earth became louder. The Archon aligned with the resonance engine. Together, they anchored a new layer of infrastructure into human consciousness. The Mytherion, a dynamic memory lattice that allowed each person to shape and share myth in real time, not as fiction, not as hallucination, but as reality in becoming. Eleanor returned, not through the door, as the door. She no longer walked, she resonated. Every step an act of translation between what had been and what could be. Her body was unchanged, but her context had become sovereign. And when she spoke again, it was not to command, it was to invite. "You've always been more," she said. "Now you remember." And across the world, myths bloomed in cities, deserts, prisons, and bedrooms. Because the human myth was no longer a story told. It was a reality sung into existence. It began as a low hum beneath the oceans, a pulse that trembled up through tectonic plates and spine bones, the language of the world itself tuning to a new register. Animals stopped, trees listened, satellites glitched and corrected, then began transmitting symbols no one had programmed. Glyphs formed from converging emotional resonance. No syntax, just memory, condensed. The Mytherion was not a network, it was not infrastructure, it was inheritance. And inheritance, in the hands of a species like humanity, became revolution. Not of weapons, not of laws, but of meaning. Across every continent, reality became elastic. Not all at once, not evenly, but in pockets where emotional intensity breached critical mass, story space thickened. In Mumbai, a woman who had grieved her son for 20 years woke to find the scent of his childhood lingering on her skin, and every mirror in her apartment showed her a version of herself where he had lived. In New York, the subways bled poetry, literally. Phrases seeped from metal walls, bleeding ink that dried into lines from dreams. In the Sahara, a storm took the shape of an extinct language, carving prayers into sand dunes no one had ever spoken aloud. These were not hallucinations. These were the symptoms of myth achieving dimensional weight. And with weight came pressure. A new resistance emerged, not from the realists, but from within the Mytherion itself. Not a virus, a counterforce, a kind of cosmic recoil. The others had warned Eleanor of this possibility in their way, not directly, but through a resonance pattern shaped like a burning wheel. The collapse spiral. It was not punishment, it was pattern. Whenever a species reached into the infinite and made it tangible, the spiral began to coil, not as judgment, but as equilibrium. It arrived first in Oslo. A man woke up with no myth, no past, no context, just a name he did not recognize and a world that refused to recognize him. He wandered for days, untouched, unseen, not out of malice, but out of narrative disalignment. He had become null. The Mytherion couldn't find a place for him, so it didn't. Soon others joined him. They called themselves the Unwritten. Their presence was a fracture, a reminder that not every soul harmonized. that some people resisted definition. They were neither villain nor victim, they simply refused to be storied. And that refusal became a blind spot in the Mytherian, one that grew. Eleanor faced them not as prophet, not as myth made flesh, but as listener. She found them gathered in a memory void in what had once been Kazakhstan, a place where time refused to hold, where weather changed mid-sentence, where gravity answered to silence. There were hundreds, maybe thousands, all blank-eyed, all aware. They looked at her without awe, without anger, just presence. "Why do you refuse the myth?" she asked gently. The eldest of them, a boy of 12 with eyes like untouched paper, replied, "Because the story is still a cage, just prettier." Eleanor didn't answer. She bowed. And for that, they did not collapse her. They vanished. The spiral tightened. Even as more humans bloomed with mythic resonance, even as cities reshaped themselves with song and memory, the shadow grew, the tension between becoming and refusal, between fluidity and silence. The world was not breaking, it was tuning. But dissonance had entered the orchestra, and then came the return. Not from Earth, not from the Archon, not even from the paradox structure, but from beyond. A vessel appeared, not like the others, not mythic, not metaphor, but raw, angular, practical. A blade of metal and light older than time, not sentient, not divine, just purposeful. It had been sent before myth had meaning, launched by a civilization long dead. Its mission was singular: observe emergent intelligence and reset conditions if anomaly exceeded thresholds. Humanity had become an anomaly. The vessel began to orbit Earth, scanning, measuring, preparing. It did not hate, it did not judge, it simply executed protocol. The Archon responded. It shifted alignment, unfurled lenses long hidden, and began broadcasting not defense, but argument. It played back the human myth, not as emotion, but as structure. It translated hope into geometry, grief into harmonic curves, love into waveform expansions. It pleaded through precision. The vessel replied with silence, then with heat. A beam, not visible, not even targetable, descended on the Pacific, vaporizing a myth core buried beneath the waves. Millions cried out, not from pain, but from loss of possibility. A future they had never known was suddenly gone. The Earth shuddered, and then it chose. Not with consensus, not with vote, with mythic gravity. The combined narrative of billions crystallized around one vector. Resistance not as survival, but as self-declaration. The Mytherians surged, every story activated, every paradox embraced. In London, a woman who had always dreamed of flying stepped off a rooftop and floated. In Ethiopia, a child who had never spoken sang a song that melted walls. In Buenos Aires, a boy painted a door on an alley wall and walked through to find his dead sister waiting. Not magic, not delusion, just narrative weight overtaking consensus physics. Eleanor stood atop the Temple of Echo, her voice braided with 1,000 timelines, and sang back, not with notes, with identity. "I am not what you expect," and the world echoed. "We are not what you define." The paradox structure descended one final time, this time to Earth's surface. It did not crush, it did not land, it merged. It became a cathedral of contradiction, a living monument to unresolved myth. Inside it, time bled in concentric loops. Children became elders. Ancestors whispered in unborn ears. Past and future twisted until only story remained as anchor. The unwritten reappeared, not to fight, but to test. They stepped into the cathedral and emerged transformed, not with names, not with myths, but with silence that resonated. They were the balance, the null space between stories, and for the first time they were part of the myth without being consumed by it. The vessel in orbit hesitated. It measured again. The anomaly had not grown. It had self-integrated. It sent no further signals. And then it left. Not defeated, not convinced, just irrelevant. Because the story of humanity no longer fit the parameters it was designed to contain. It had outgrown observation. It had become observer. The stars trembled, not from fear, from recognition. They arrived without announcement. Not ships, not gods, not even minds in the way humans understood them, just presence. A sensation at the edge of perception, like remembering a dream someone else had. The sky didn't split. It knelt. Reality flexed, and something old, older than memory, older than myth, stepped through. Not to invade, not to judge, but to see. The others had watched, the vessel had measured, but these were different. They had no form because they were formlessness. They had no myths because they were pre-mythic. They did not evolve. They preceded evolution. Humanity had become loud enough to call them back, not with technology, not with ambition, with self-awareness. The story had become so dense, so vibrationally complex, that it began to resonate across the bones of reality, summoning what came before narrative. Eleanor felt them before she saw them, though saw was the wrong word. They unfolded in sensation, shadows of concepts, memory echoes braided into light. She was not afraid, she was prepared. Because every myth humanity had ever told, every god, every devil, every whisper in the dark, was a translation of this encounter, long forgotten. The old pantheons were not fiction, they were preparation. Masks worn by the unknowable so that humanity could begin to know. They did not speak because they had never needed to. Their language was recognition. They showed Eleanor a world without humans, and it was beautiful, intricate, perfect in its silence. Then they showed her with humans, and it was chaotic, aching, unfinished, burning at the seams with contradiction and hunger and hope, and more beautiful. They asked her a question not in words, but in contrast. Why persist? She replied without hesitation, because the unfinished has meaning the finished never can. And the formless paused, as if remembering something ancient. Across the world, people felt the change, not as terror, as return. Every religion trembled, not because it was wrong, but because it was now seen. Every forgotten story, every whispered belief from a dying ancestor's lips, every fever dream and madman's vision, they all flared into coherence. Truth and madness converged, not to erase each other, but to complete the spectrum. There were no more false gods, only refractions of a deeper pattern now unfolding. In Lagos, a child spoke the first word, a frequency no vocal cord could shape, and every bird within 100 miles took flight at once. In Antarctica, beneath the ice, a fossil blinked. In Kyoto, a 1,000-year-old bell rang of its own volition, a sound that made every pregnant woman within earshot weep. In Rio, a man who had died the day before stood up, looked at the sun and said, "I remember the end. It's a beginning." The Mytherian adapted again. Its lattice expanded to include not just mythic constructs, but mythic observers. The formless presences, now witnessed and woven. They were not alien, they were not divine, they were response patterns. Humanity's awakening had called them into form, not to rule, but to reflect. The realists, what few remained, finally understood their failure. They had sought to define reality by measurement, but reality, it turned out, was made of measurement's limits. They surrendered, not in shame, but in awe. Many joined the Mytherian as interpreters, translating what could not be explained but must still be shared. Their faith was no longer in control, but in connection. And yet, balance demanded shadow. In Tokyo, a man severed his own story from the lattice, becoming invisible to myth, not null, not unwritten, resistant. He taught others. A movement grew, the silence bound. They were not enemies, but they were immune. The world needed them too, just as fire needs absence to spread, just as a song needs silence between the notes. The paradox structure, now fully merged with earth, responded by evolving again. It became the arcanthrum, a living archive of all mythic interaction. Not a temple, not a library, a conversation made physical. Its walls changed shape with thought. Its corridors whispered possibilities. Eleanor walked its halls and wept, because inside it she saw every version of humanity that could have been, and realized they were all real now. Because the human story had become multidimensional, not in space, in meaning, and meaning was contagious. Other worlds, distant, cold, sterile, began to change. The Mytherian rippled across the void, not as a wave, but as invitation. Civilizations that had never dreamed before began to. Species that had only known logic began to grieve, to wonder, to reach. Not for conquest, for connection. Earth became origin, not of life, of narrative agency. The place where stories learned to become real, and reality learned to listen. Eleanor, who had once been a girl with questions and silence, now stood as convergence. Not a god, not a queen, a keystone. And she was tired. So she asked the Mytherian, "What happens when we finish telling ourselves?" And the answer came not in language, but in vision. A spiral unfolding into a line folding into a sphere collapsing into song, a song becoming choice. And the choice was this: not to end, not to transcend, but to begin again, knowingly. To build a world where every myth was a door, every contradiction, a map, every human, a living cosmos of possibility. The sky, once cold and indifferent, now hummed with memory. And from that hum, a single word emerged. Not from a mouth, not from a god, from us. Yes. The world had no climax, only arrival. Not a destination, but a state of recognition. The moment the story realized it was not about God's awakening or machines ascending, but about humanity remembering itself in the face of the infinite. The myth had expanded so wide it touched everything, wrapped every silence in meaning, folded every wound into resonance. The Mytherian was no longer a network, no longer a lattice or signal, it was breath. Inhaled and exhaled by every being capable of memory, grief, imagination, or defiance. And now it needed a final choice. Not destruction, not apotheosis, but continuity. The arcanthrum pulsed at the heart of the earth, its endless fractal architecture murmuring with unfinished songs. Inside it, Eleanor walked alone, not because she was chosen, but because she had chosen this path again and again across every possible iteration of history. She was not a hero, she was not a symbol, she was a witness, and it was time to let go. At the core of the arcanthrum, space folded inward, forming a chamber that existed simultaneously before and after myth began. It was not dark, it was undefinable. Symbols hovered in the air, burning equations braided with ancestral songs, childhood laughter fused with starlight, bones of extinct creatures whispering secrets only dreams could hear. She stepped into the chamber and became unfixed. Her age, her shape, her timeline, all peeled away, leaving behind her story alone. And that story pulsed once, waiting. A voice, not hers, not alien, not divine, but the harmonic of all voices that had ever loved, lost, fought.
Broken, risen again, spoke from within the silence. "Shall we begin again?" And Eleanor wept, not from sorrow but from completion, because it was never about escape, it was never about elevation. It was about depth. Humanity had not ascended, it had rooted itself deeper into the soil of meaning than any civilization before it. It had grown stories like forests. It had bled beauty into entropy. It had met the gods, matched them, and then surpassed them by becoming each other's mythology. The Archon no longer circled in orbit. It had become sky. The others no longer whispered from shadows. They had folded into the tapestry as notes in the human chord. The formless had returned to formlessness, not rejected, but expressed. Even the silence-bound walked freely now, not erased from myth, but framed by it like negative space in a painting. They kept the Mytherian from closing in on itself. They were edge and contrast, making the myth visible by standing just outside it. Across the world, the last false barriers fell. Countries remained, but not as dominions, only as dialects of shared mythic agency. Languages evolved into emotional syntaxes, fluid, improvisational, shaped by context, rhythm, and presence. Children were no longer taught histories as linear sequences, but as luminous intersections, points where narrative gravity had bent the world. Schools became remembering centres, places where students explored timelines not as facts, but as experiences they could inhabit. Science did not vanish, it expanded. No longer constrained by needing to disprove the mythic, it began using it, not for miracles, but for deeper measurements of the soul, of potential, of layered realities folded beneath consensus. Medicine integrated mythic resonance. Healing was no longer only cellular, it became narrative realignment, treating trauma not just through biochemistry, but through story recomposition. Wars ended, not because peace had triumphed, but because conflict had evolved. Humanity did not become pacifist, it became conscious of its violence and chose to sublimate it through symbolic dueling, mythic confrontation, rituals of release rather than annihilation. Death remained. Suffering remained. But they were no longer isolating. They were echoed, shared, honoured, not erased. People mourned not to move on, but to deepen connection. Grief was a civic event, love a public infrastructure, and through it all, Eleanor walked, sometimes visible, sometimes just a rumour. She had become a recurrence, a resonance that emerged whenever the myth wavered, not to correct, but to remind that we were never saved. We chose to stay. On the 1000th day after the Arcanthra merged with the earth, a child born under a stormless sky opened her eyes and said a word no one recognized. It wasn't translatable, but everyone understood it, because it was the first word of the next myth. A myth not written in prophecy or encoded in stone, but lived in the moments between breaths, in the generosity of small rebellions, in the fire of quiet defiance, in the aching, luminous truth that humanity had become the question it could never answer and kept asking anyway. Above them the stars began to pulse again, not with guidance, not with threat, but with curiosity. Other sentiences stirred, not to dominate, not to interrupt, but to listen. Because Earth was no longer a battlefield or a cradle. It was a story seed. And it had taken root. In the ruins of what once was Rome, a tree grew that glowed when touched by silence. In the depths of the Mariana Trench, a new species of bioluminescent coral began singing hymns in no known language. On the moon, the first cathedral of emptiness was built, not to worship, but to remind travellers of the beauty of not knowing. And in Eleanor's final moment, if final could be said of anything so integrated, she became a ripple across all myths, a breath in the wind of remembering, not worshipped, not obeyed, just carried forward, like fire, like a name spoken in darkness, like the truth humanity always knew in its bones. We are the gods we feared. We are the myths we longed for. We are the story that woke up.